it would feel unnatural for me in this part of the conversation to just go and welcome Tom to a network session on Professor Jang. Let me hit you with the 12-minute riff on that. You know, was there, I'm just curious to sort of drop back in with where we were in general. I think it was you who first, pointed me toward Jang's work, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was in about
I
like
got pointed to by
October-ish.
Kyle,
Okay.
and then yeah, I think John and I were with you at the time.
Yeah, that's right. It was either yourself or John in my mind. And was that in like August, September, or October? Earlier?
Yeah, no, I
It could
think
have been
around then.
earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a while now though.
Yeah, it was a little while. I would say, we weren't early to it. I had noticed his letters popping up for several months before then, and I had clicked through one or two, but I'd clicked off very quickly. I think I remember sharing that with you. It was several months before I felt engaged enough to invest the time. And the conversation we had was motivating for me to do that. And it's curious to attempt to connect with what my aversion to digging a little deeper was, and the sense of that, you know, my own judgment of what's popping up on that algorithm and how accurate that was or not. And I think in some ways I was quite accurate. But of course, I have found tremendous value at various levels in listening to his lectures, and in particular, listening to him engage with different platforms around the world and across the generations, because he's been on many now and he wants to do the podcast circuit in America. Whether he decides to risk going, I think there's a calculation for him in that. I'm not sure. But, enter retention. Jiang Xueqin is definitely real. And so I've found it very interesting to reflect on the landscape of attention and what about him has influenced his rise, how people are relating with him, what he's bringing to the cultural zeitgeist, what he's influencing. So yeah, there's a lot there. But I'm curious what your curiosity is around relating to Jang.
Hmm. I watched that interview that you posted, the 30-minute one. I forget the channel name. It was a strange name.
Mehdi Hassan on Zateo. It's a large one. He's a large,
That's it.
he's a particular kind of culture war leftist with a British left background. He's worked on Al Jazeera for a long time. He's sees himself as, he's written books on debate. He takes a very aggressive, confrontational approach. He really takes on the defense for whatever his perspective on the common sense good opinion is with respect to some, what in his image would be a humanitarian leftist perspective, but is very much mired in attempting to defend some coherent landmass within a culture war that has far too many cracks in it to be able to do that. And so I think he's kind of one of the examples of where debate as an art form continually not only meets its limitation, but just ends up creating more fractures, which isn't to say it doesn't have value, but nevertheless, he's one of the more fearsome opponents in that arena from that part of the political spectrum you could possibly speak to. So in that regard, you know, it's an interesting one to see Jiang relate to.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things that jumped out at me was I personally felt there was a bit of a contrast where it kind of I felt like Zhang looked more integrated as a result of the interaction. And I felt like the other guy had more of that cartoonish quality of like a mouthpiece. And it kind of, I think what it like strengthened in me was just a sensitivity to maybe Zhang's a specific kind of integrity relating to the intellectual endeavor. And I almost feel like it feels like to some degree you could compartmentalize that and just acknowledge the value in it without like being too critical of what might be adjacent to that in his personality structure. And that was just what kind of stood out to me. There was a kind of there was a certain kind of humility, and there was a questions at moments where I was wondering how much of it was performative. He definitely feels like the kind of person who could sort of put on the character at different layers of sort of depth. But at the same time, I did feel like a kind of sincerity there that is interesting and that's the first time I've heard him speaking with someone. And it's always interesting to see how that contrasts from someone's presentational mode. And a lot of the things I find jarring in his presentational mode felt like there was more balance in how he was relating. And even in a weird way, there was some like second person capacity there, I felt, albeit coming from a more like analytical lens. He was actually in the encounter, which immediately for me is that just feels really good to witness. But also acknowledging like the bar was pretty low when contrasted to the mode that he was kind of interacting with. So I'll start off just by bringing that in as like a very just present moment experience that I had just today. Um, and maybe there's some like avenues in there for branching out more into the ideas themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. There was something released on one of the largest, I think, Gen Z conversational podcasts that's run by a guy called Jack Neal. And I think Jack flew to Hong Kong and filmed two conversations with Jang there. And you really get to see more of the participation in the encounter in that regard. You almost get to see a tiny bit more of the celebrity personality that he's also been wanting to share in the background. And he doesn't quite say as much as that, but he does share that, some years ago, he was listening, in fact, to some of the early IDW conversations. He mentioned people like Brett Weinstein, Brett and Eric and all the rest of them, and was thinking to himself, I would like to go on your podcasts, but why would they speak to a Chinese high school teacher? You know? And so he thought, well, and so he said, well, what I could do is start a YouTube channel and make a bunch of predictions. And if they turn out to be right, that would be interesting. He said a little bit more than that. And he was saying all of this in a mode which does bring a little bit into question whether or not that's the most truthful perspective he could share, which is a curious thing about Jang, because one of the, let's say, challenges that I have with the way in which he shows up as an epistemic authority, as an authority on knowledge, is that he will mediate what perspectives he's bringing to the person he's speaking to. Now, in a sense, that's very natural. That's a very, very natural thing to do. And in and of itself, it by no means is that a critique. But what I'm speaking about is, in some contexts, he will present his theories involving eschatology as the primary explanatory factor for happenings in the Middle East and world affairs, for example, as the core of his as the core of what informs his predictions. Certainly when he lectures, he'll sort of step into the most charitable thing we could say is that he steps into the performance of bringing to as much clarity and compulsion as he can whatever the argument is he's making. And every 5 or 6 lectures, he'll say something like, this is all speculation, and you shouldn't just believe what I'm saying, and you should think for yourself. That really what I'm about is promoting people to think for themselves. And then he might nuance things otherwise and go, well, actually, eschatology here, I'm not sure how much of a factor it is, but it's a vectoral influence. And I think that's a powerful way to frame it. I think there's really some relevance to that. And if we take a look at a bunch of different explanatory frames and gain a sense of their vectoral directionality, then I think we can develop a coherent picture that we can invest some amount of trust in that is, uh, you know, distinct from just investing the trust in one of these frames. And so there is that if you engage him over enough span of time and are most charitable with respect to his disclaimers, there is that epistemic humility there at one level. But it's not what comes across in his mode of address. And that's the core of what I've been writing about in relation. And there's something about that critique. There's a little bit more to it. I shouldn't say it's the core, but it's definitely an important point. And there's something about that which I'm almost concerned is slightly too weak of a critique. That it's just a mode of address critique. And so we need to go into that a little bit deeper. But as you mentioned, seeing Jang interact in a way that opens up more to that second person encounter and is closer into the participating in the understanding together, there is a sense in which we're both kind of looking at that and going, how one interacts in that context is a really important signal for the integrity that they are coming from and enabling about understanding in general. The final point I'll make in relation there, which is in a way a repetition of it from another angle, and it comes across in that conversation with Mehdi Hassan, because Mehdi Hassan at one point says something about facts, and Yang is like, well, I'm not, I think you should slow down on thinking facts are all that, you know, and there's something about that which I really agree with in the sense of we don't just sort of construct our worldviews or sense of who we are in relation to what matters by encountering a whole bunch of facts. There's all these layers of interpretation and, in the Viveki sense, you have relevance realization and a whole bunch of different processes of contextually situating ourselves in relation to what we care about. And in Yang's terms, speculation or, hypothesis generation. And he'll obviously speak about making predictions, but in general, perceiving gestalts switching between various frames which may not have or may not even be amenable to facts of the matter, authenticating them at every step of the way may be necessary to gain some abductive or intuitional sense of how things fit together. There's, much more to be said there, but nevertheless, the point is that, on the one hand, Jang is skeptical of, right and rightly so, just that kind of schooling, which is to do with the consuming and onboarding of facts and trivia and prep for standardized testing to just be part of the human capital system of feeding the machine. And yet, it does seem to me that the way he conveys his information is from that same basis of authoritative transmission, which people are absolutely accustomed to hearing, that typically delivers knowledge or the truth from that frequency. And so there's an interesting contradiction there with respect, again, to the mode of address, how he participates in understanding and what he's really cultivating and supporting in terms of thinking capacity, and how he is presenting ideas. You know, he'll joke that you've all been brainwashed, but maybe I'm brainwashing you too, you know? And there is a sense in which part of the way that he's bringing ideas into the zeitgeist, it's slightly more toward the way of finding hosts for perspectives that otherwise are difficult to put together than it is making primary the endeavor to support the structures and relational contexts of understanding in which we can relate more intimately to how we're forming our beliefs and what perspectives are influencing us, or something like that. We haven't seen him, I think, engage in, well, I put it like this. I don't think his attentional prominence has come about by virtue of his dialogical mode. It's come about by virtue of this lecturing mode. And so it is interesting to see him begin to interact with a number of these other figures. But as far as I can tell, he's oriented toward choosing the platforms which are of most attentional benefit to him. And it's quite interesting hearing him state one of his goals, in a sense, was to do this. He'll also say, you know, we started the channel and we thought if we get 5,000 subscribers in a couple of years, that would be a great success. And he wants to keep lean. But there's clearly, as he's expressed, a very deep aspiration there to be in the mixer, in the marketplace, in the contest of ideas as such. And so it remains to be seen how vulnerable he's willing to be with his truth-making process, basically, something like that.
One angle that comes to mind is just the relationship between him and those students. I think that really says it all in a way. And that's what I found, like there's such a comedic aspect to all of this, which is why it works so bloody well. There's the authoritarian energy, and then there's this kind of like tricksterish self-awareness that loosens a lot of that and almost seems to get him off the hook. And then like that kind of humility that's much more like propositionally asserted than it is like relationally felt. So yeah, I think that in that it could be tempting to just dismiss him in a way, but in a way he can't be dismissed, and that's what I think. Like even like in my body, like I can't quite dismiss him, and I think that's one of the questions that's here with us. Like, what's that about? And I felt like the plot only thickened when I watched that interview.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't get more like. Normally, you hope that when they're with the other person, they just make it known to everyone that they have no capacity to like be in the diversity of perspective. But I think we could have predicted that listening to him, where he's not just like dogmatic. There is some other part of him, albeit more like a computational part of him or a like rules-based part of him that like needs to open the door at the end of like he constructs this world and then he like leaves the door ajar
Right.
at the end of it. But he doesn't give anyone the means to exit. Like that's not part of the process. And I kind of my ongoing concern when I was originally listening to him was like, I'm pretty sure these kids going to be fucked up at the end of this. The kind like the layers of veil that are being ripped off,
Right.
albeit like more intellectually, less kind of spiritually. It's still, you kind of hear the kids in their response and the things they're like probing into. It's kind of jarring to feel the difference in the thing he's wielding and like these people that are receiving it. And even the comment section, I've only seen a few, but the meme structure is just like there, just on first glance of how he's being held.
Right.
Um, and there is a kind of, there's a liberation that I think people feel in his presence. And maybe like, I think in the same like card that Trump plays, he's playing a similar card, but he's got that like intellectual bent and this kind of very ambiguous background that it's kind of like he feels like an anti-hero. Like he's sort of almost on this like
Mm,
vigilante arc, but then there's
mm,
also, yeah, I don't know.
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me see. There's a couple paragraphs I'll read here. So nominally, he's a Chinese high school teacher, though not a full citizen of China, who grew up in Canada and graduated from Yale with a bachelor's degree in English literature. He's a well-read, tremendously effective communicator, at least as judged on the merit of the number of people tuning in. He's also an epistemic cowboy and appears several steps ahead of most of the higher attention commentariat in describing patterns of power at play in the wild, wild world. He plays fast and loose, but he's also ready to stand and deliver. He shouldn't be dismissed, and he's been one of the more interesting influences on narratives across certain channels of the zeitgeist. So that sort of speaks to a similar sense
Yeah.
in the mm, you mentioned anti-hero or the vigilante. There's a certain sense in which he stands on his own 2 feet. Now, people will of course accuse him of being, backed up by even a team of researchers. Right now, I don't think that's true. I certainly believe that people are of the capacity to have the breadth of knowledge he at least communicates in his lectures. Now, we should say these lectures are rarely more than an hour long, and they, you know, he is in control of what topics are explored or not, and he'll often move through centuries of history in mere minutes. And so, of course, there's a pick and choose in what story to tell. And certainly, when I've heard him discuss some of the philosophers who I have more of a depth of understanding for, some of the great philosophers, he'll brush over Kant, Hegel, and others so quickly in a way where I'm like, well, that's quite a pick and choose there, and to speak that this is what a student ought to take as the core truth or insight is potentially quite perverting of what the depth of philosophy is there. And so it's always interesting when you do have a basis of some expertise to recognize when someone who's speaking across a lot of subjects might not be treating them with, un uh, well, depth in all ways. There's another paragraph here which I'll skip ahead, which may give people some reference. Jang is highly capable, as evidenced by the scale of his audience, at presenting non-conventional ideas in conventional frequencies of expression. At the level of the idea, Jang brings a breadth and depth which is uncommon to the surface level commentariat, but in my view, his mode of address doesn't support a different quality of participation or metabolization in and of itself. I believe this provides partial explanation for his sharp rise to attentional prominence. He's perhaps most well known for the candor and boldness with which he voices taboo ideas and contexts. Think Epstein, elite networks, secret societies, the corrosive, predatory nature of transnational financing capital, trafficking, laundering, religious eschatology and its connection to politics. All of this so in need of address in our time. He provides historical narratives, lines of logic, and news cycle current media to contextualize these subjects with the effect of building appealing and coherent frames of explanation, frames which the zeitgeist is craving in this time of instability, uncertainty, disintegration, and breakdown of global order. By global order, I mean the normativities, apparent rules, interpretive narratives, and general stability of power relations. All of these appear to be in flux, and there are tens of millions upon tens of millions who are noticing. There's obviously lots to go on with that, but it is that putting together a whole bunch of in many respects, the contradictions and the corrupt, predatory, nefarious aspects underlying the power structures, the empire that the majority of his audience lives within or is on the periphery on, in a time where more and more people are seeing that the emperor has no clothes. And I think it's, one of the things he's showing is that whatever remains of polite society's imposition on the Overton window of what can be expressed or not, to the degree you are paying your tax to that, you are not participating with the energy of attention and where it wants to flow today. I mean, at the very least. And so I also find it curious how, people will often ask him, are you at risk for speaking about some of these things? Because he will occasionally be critical of China. In fact, initially I was detecting that he was not speaking to many of things he could have. And that for sure is still the case. His focus is definitely more, outwards than it is inwards with respect to China. But he does point out many of the lacks China has, some of its vulnerabilities. And he will speak to the sort of atheist vacuousness in the modern Chinese psyche, or what has been conditioned there. He'll lay the blame of that in many respects at the foot of the modern West, but implicating, Chinese elites in wanting to go study over in the West and what have you. But nevertheless, people will say, well, are you at risk in speaking? And, it did strike me a couple of days ago that it's maybe the people who are in America and the Western countries who are actually at a lot more risk of speaking about some of these topics. You couldn't imagine a teacher, you couldn't imagine a professor speaking on what Jang speaks to in Western countries. And so there is an interesting way in which the dynamics of, the ascendancy, relatively speaking, because of the descendancy of the US and that kind of empire, that because of the multipolarity we're entering into, that certain figures coming into the globalized attentional context have a structural basis in some of these other geopolitical power blocks, and as such are able, in fact, to bring perspective that otherwise cannot be voiced, which is nevertheless tremendously relevant to truth. Which isn't to say what he's bringing is truth as such, but it's enriching of the epistemic plurality. And, you know, as I've said, these are dynamics which must be related to. He also spoke to Alexander Dugin a few days ago, on Sneako's stream, Sneako being one of the largest Gen Z streamers who will also do content about religion and politics and what have you. Very, very influential. And Alexander Dugin, for some, he's a chief propagandist of you know, the Putin aligned Orthodox Christians in Russia who have a particular, in their own way, view of the unfolding of history with respect to who has the right to live where in the Eurasian landmass and what will become of the different peoples around the world in relation. But he's a powerful figure, Alexander Dugin, there sitting in his office with the picture of his daughter, I believe, who was assassinated, by the Ukrainians 4 years ago at the start of the war, when they were, I believe, meaning to assassinate him as well, or maybe they didn't mean to, I don't know. And, so there we have Alexander Dugin, probably the most well-known Russian-based cultural, philosophical influence as, known topically by the West. And now Jang, who, I'm certainly not saying is an agent of the CCP. I could believe that there is uh, a mixture of implicit with some subtle, explicit uh, allowances or support for his positionality with respect to what he's expressing, which again, it isn't in and of itself a reason not to engage. And we've got to really watch out for that because, pick your elites in the West that you want to bind your sense of what's a good opinion to listen to or not. We don't live in a time in which there is some gracious lord, gracious elite structure, right? Who we should be accepting control our sense of what we listen to. And so, even in that, I think the cognitive dissonance that he must evoke for more and more people is tremendous because say he is, a CCP agent par excellence. It's like, well, what are you then? Are you on the side of CIA? Is that what you're on? Are we going to go CIA versus CCP and the CIA are the good guys? Who are the good guys in this? What vision of the world? What's going on here? You know, all of this, is in a way in flux and needs to be engaged, obviously with integrity. I'm not presenting a basic picture there or some naive optimism in any respect for the vision of the future that China might be putting forward. But there's a meaningful difference in the, civilizational history of China as a people and as a geopolitical entity. They go about things differently, and they do seem to have a very different view on empire and control and orientation toward their own population. That's different to an orientation they have for what's beyond their borders. I mean, it's all a very complex world, eh? And Jiang is in the middle of all of that and riding the wave on all of that and being asked and treated as one of the prime experts on the geopolitical unfoldings of our time. And he's very willing to present an answer to everything. And that's, of course, what people want to hear. They just want to hear an answer in the form of content to a question, to reveal something. And, that's something he has to reckon with. He has to reckon with the mode of presentation he's engaging with respect to the treatment of the context for understanding itself. And, if someone like Jang was to listen to that, that would be, well, I don't even know how much of that would even be coming across. I see him as kind of a figure that's sort of almost perfectly situated to ride the wave of attention still in ascendance into the conversational fold in quotation marks. And so far in that context, it's been enough just to point towards the value of family, community, thinking for yourself. None of these obviously are new ideas. And it's enough so far to just say that that's what you're for, as in a sense, some response to the question of what should we do, or how should we be responsible or relating with each other in some more fundamental embodied way. And maybe we've still got a number of years where that is all that's needed, because actually what's wanted is the delivery of content that is both sort of on the edge of chaos while at the same time soothing enough to fulfill the desire of late night algorithm browsing, you know?
Yeah, you used the word cowboy earlier on. That kind of came back up. And then when you were talking about Dugan, I was sort of thinking about the chief and the priest. And that's what I was kind of hearing underlying a big portion of what you just said is just that question of alignment. And yeah, well, like, what is the cowboy aligned with? Like, is it just their own sort of will, or is it freedom itself? And there, yeah, there's a kind of like, there's a pain in Jang that I feel, and it does feel like a maybe, and you always got to be careful with these kinds of things, but probably goes without saying, um, I kind of feel some sort of isolation, um, and it like, yeah, that isolation that is so often accompanying the building of a tower. Um, but yeah, the question of like, who is the tower for? Like, is it just a kind of, is he just a martyr of sorts? Like, I really feel that energy in him. Like he would sort of like,
Yeah.
blow himself up, and it's partly for truth, but it's also partly like something else. And there's kind of also some other part in him that wouldn't want to go through with that. Like it,
Yeah. I I
yeah. And
feel all
I'm
those
just speaking to
tensions.
subtle feeling tones here, of course, but um, yeah, I sort of, there are moments when I've been listening to him where he does sort of signal these really important values, um, and not in a way that feels like it has heart behind it, but it does feel like it has, um, like the signature of some kind of truth. Um, yeah, but then there are moments where, yeah, I guess it's something else, and that's the question of like, what is that something else? Is it allegiance to a power? Is it like a self inflating drive? Like maybe that's kind of one of the bigger questions here is like, what is it that's accompanying the things that feel virtuous? And I think it's kind of the path he takes with these qualities of just like absolute disregard for politeness, kind of absolute, something about the way he talks about the homosexuality struck me as like
I
that there's
haven't heard him
something,
speak about that.
he's one of his like mechanisms for the secret societies is about how like men who go off to war
Ah,
engage sexually as a bonding behavior or
right.
something like that.
Yeah.
And the times he brought that up, it felt like there was something else there. Um,
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I do remember. I do remember that lecture now. Yeah, it's interesting, in a conversation like this because there is so much content that he shares which can be critiqued just at the level of content. So it is funny in that there is a sense in which in presenting, at least as I have, some of the interest here being what can we learn about the dynamics of attention and how does he fit into that context of significance and awareness right now in terms of his how he presents and where he's coming from, because I do think this really matters. I do think it's more interesting in terms of it being more generative, at least at the for the so the interests and dedications we have in common. But for the most part, of course, for 99%, I'm sure of his listeners and viewers, what people would be expecting would be, well, where do you disagree with him? What piece of content might you have some issue with? And I suppose I never really engaged with him as someone with whom I was drawn to critique at that level. I've mentioned in some of the early things I saw of him speak about various philosophers in which I thought this is not a deep enough treatment. But I haven't visited those again in like 6 months. And so I can't bring them to presence here with the appropriate epistemic credibility and for him, treatment of him in relation. But there are things which he's said in relation to, for instance, North Korea being primed to gain an ascendant position in world affairs through the process of global collapse as he sees it coming, because the population is what are his categories? It's something like they have energy, um, is it unity, and then maybe something else. And there are certain things there which seem to me to just be absurd, that he's often not, uh, I think, like everyone is prone to, he can place members of, he'll place people or countries or different kinds of content within his interpretive schema. But actually, all he's been really interested in doing is just defining what the interpretive schema is and not actually providing a supporting case for whether X or Y country or person actually belongs in that schema. And so there are ways in which he'll populate the interpretations, he'll populate the maps he's providing with uh, outlandish kinds of bias, which, is in a sense a very natural thing to do, because to slow down and actually argue for and with rigor integrate the various frames of references he's offering is not possible to do that within a 50-minute lecture that's tying together all these things. And so, there's errors of overfitting and underfitting that are going on, but he has a massive bias for completeness rather than consistency. And so it's about getting across enough of the big picture framing to keep the narrative of interest at that level stimulated and moving, rather than it is to slow down and share in mutual understanding for what's actually coloring and filling out that map. He will obviously provide argument for various things, and many of those things I think are super valuable to engage with. And he's also shared lines of logic that I think are powerful. I think his I think he has his own particular characterization of game theory and hasn't introduced that subject from the perspective of uh, game theory as a more universally accessible or taught subject. I think it's been game theory according to Jang from the very beginning. But there is a sense in which he is, if you take a very liberal definition of game theory as how agents compete to win a game, then you know, he's doing game theory, I guess, because he's uh, naming entities which are in competition in some ways, and here's what they are going to be motivated to do based on the elements of the game he's identifying. But the challenge is that across all these different levels of analysis, from eschatology to breakdown of empire to, psychology and hubris of Trump and a whole, inter-elite conflict and various kinds of where the globalist versus national MAGA agenda, all these different frames. And then all of a sudden making an argument about, well, in the collapse of the Persian Empire or in the collapse of Rome, we see X and Y, therefore we can see this and that based on historical. And it's like there isn't the rigor of connectivity between these frames provided. It's often just switching here and there. And so in that respect, the the domain of analysis that the game theory is about shifts on his whim. And it's, you know, and I find it valuable still to engage with his perspective on how these dynamics are going to play out at those particular domains. But it does make him again this there's a certain sense of mystery with respect to what he is for and what his motivations are in relation to any of it. And he'll give answers for that, right? He'll say, oh, actually, all I care about is my family. You know, I don't really care about any of this. But then he'll also be like, well, no, actually, I believe everybody's got a divine spark. And actually, the thing I'm most proud of is igniting this spark in other people. And it's a spark of truth or something like this. And so actually, I'm kind of a libertarian over here. And then he's, you know, there is and I will say, because he has spoken about this too, in his one of the ways he will describe his psychological past. And, there's a lot more to it than what I'm about to say, but at least one of the points was that he had a belief in one, that IQ was all important, how well you could do maths and how clearly you could articulate yourself. Two, that the world was zero-sum competition. And I forget what he said was number three, but may have been a sort of a combination of those, in the sense of he found it difficult to be happy for other people's success or something like this. He wasn't. He was frustrated with his own lack of recognition. He wanted to be successful, but it wasn't grounded in something. And he'll present these as things which he's sort of overcome and had insight about through meeting his now wife, various experiences, putting himself out there and learning things. And that's all, awesome. There's no critique from me here with respect to charting a psychological journey that's sort of opening to deeper sort of love and understanding and appreciation for the diversity of what, beats in life. But there is something nevertheless interesting about identifying a very strong drive to succeed, to win, and to, in some respects, uh, shape his expression around Well, what ultimately becomes the really the exact kind of expression that's capable of generating a massive scale of attentional interest in what many people relate to as the fundamental explanatory narratives and frames for understanding not only world affairs, but also our spiritual basis of participation in them. And so there is, in a sense, there is a drive there which has not seemingly cultivated itself in group or community or broader relational belonging in the process of cultivating its projects and efforts at building and sharing. It is in its own way a fairly individual, a very individualist, again, this kind of cowboy type story. And that is still, I think, what is most appealing, what attention wants. It wants characters that deliver content at the frequency that people stay attending to. That provides that mediation on the edge of chaos of some new frames coming in without rocking the boat enough or too much, but still jostling it. And I think there is a generativity in him entering the stage. I think you can learn actually a lot from Jang, but it's always a question to me how much one needs to already have cultivated a an integrity of epistemology in order to gain more than one might give over to what does seemingly cultivate a kind of guru adoration, just like every other high attention figure has, you know, from Jordan Peterson through the rest. And I do. I think part of him does want that, while at the same time also being somewhat aware of it. But I'm, you know, I can only be at the level of sort of immanent transpersonal sensitivity to the seeking energies of becoming that are swirling in and around human beings as they relate to each other and the world. I don't see someone who's, and there's a biographical case to make for this by his own admission. I don't see someone who has grown through that process. I see that being largely absent. That psychoanalysis in general is largely absent. And so we might have really just, you know, the right next combination of spice entering the attentional field, playing at the game of rational discourse. We might evidence the kind of capacity to be patient, stand and deliver in front of a Mehdi Hassan and end up doing the whole podcast circuit and in some respects blowing people's minds and actually finding a tremendous amount of alignment with many, many people, because I do see him paying attention to things which, again, most of the commentariat isn't. And they are, because we as a whole have not been able to speak about these things with each other in so many ways, being able to deliver the home truths about them in a time where they're unavoidable to look at. There's all these, oh yeah, of course. It's like, oh yeah, of course. I guess that is kind of how it is. That is kind of what's happening now. Oh yeah, look at all the Epstein emails. And that offers a there's a clear space to attain an authority in that context by being the one who's delivering that message. But again, yeah, it seems to me to be, yeah, it's called for by the present paradigm in ascendancy, which I still do see as, I was going to say it's, you know, well, it's, I can certainly say lacking in various ways. Now, what are those ways? Am I in a position to articulate some sort of what even is attentionalism as a paradigm? What is it to articulate something after that? We've explored that in the podcast here and there. I'm not going to attempt to do that right now. I'd rather write about it a little bit more first. But yeah, there's a piece to tie up there. I suppose the question, and this is where again I think this is one of the arguments I'll make for the generativity of him as a figure, and probably one of the things that um, motivates me to tune in. And I enjoy listening to a lot of what he's had to share. And as I've said, I think he has value to offer. I am curious about what the power slash, influence is that the new slash emerging symbolic or narratival class is able to effectuate onto the world stage. The old gatekeepers are no longer are no longer at the level of what people are attending to and what's influencing them. They are obviously still doing so in some pockets, but there's a new class of priest and storyteller, and maybe they are in a sense kind of vigilante individuals who have their own undiscovered, unexpressed contexts of belonging or commitments that do draw people into question, and which receive, in a way, kind of smoke and mirrors, because that's all that can be offered in a sense. You He will just say, like to Mehdi Hassan, I could be a useful idiot, or actually you can't really know, but and regardless, there's value in the narratives he has to bring, even with that mystery there, and that's what people were interested in anyway. And so and I don't think there will be efforts made to move that step forward in addressing the challenges to the very integrity of the relational truth-making process there, that you would need a deeper kind of participation for, and more of a context and attentional awareness of those dynamics and care put towards that. And yeah, because of the changes in global power, the shifting in poles of power in various ways, with sort of interpretation, narrative, story, and contest in that regard for sense-making frameworks that tie people's sense of who they are in relation to world affairs. Because all of that is shifting, there is, at the level of content, a bunch of novelty that's coming in, and I think that does have that will have an effect and influence. It's not inert. I don't know where it leads, but I don't think it's necessarily bad in terms of what it portends. I think there is still an integrity of what it is to engage at that level in that context. And so on the one hand, it's like a very profound critique, and on the other hand, an extremely subtle critique, and also there's a sense of recognizing what this type of character is and what their function as an agent and a life work is, and in some respects, one could say, why hold them to the critique of, a different archetype or a different way of participating for a different time? Now, so really, I don't know how much longer we're really going to spend on this, or returning to it in the network or have you, because I'm not ultimately interested enough in the novelty of content that he's bringing, because I don't think it is. It's more the putting together of things which cannot be easily discussed in such a context. Um, so I don't think there is enough novelty there to uh, commit the time and energy to addressing for its contradictions at the level of content. For me, it feels at this point enough to gesture at it because I have made those discernments, and I guess I'm not sort of in my own way then taking responsibility for engaging at the level of disagreement that many people would want to be hearing. Maybe I could, I said the thing about North Korea there. I am detecting how he's shifting his explanations for what's going on in Iran at the moment. And I think the speculation that he does bring in around the various sort of bloodlines and, really, what's the word? The most debauched form of occult practice associated with how, certain elites bind themselves together. I do think the degree to which he's caught up in his own fantasy projections about that, as an author, a fiction author himself, are significant. And at the same time, there's something to be said for all that. And so there is something, in a way, kind of quite problematic about, again, how he will fictionalize and populate the content that, again, fills out the interpretive schemas and maps he's providing. The way he colors in the maps is sometimes all manner of color, right? It's like fucking red here, the face is green, right? But the shape is interesting. And, you know, how relevant is it? The problem is that it's so relevant to what people will pay attention to on the algorithm. And the problem is that the level of uncertainty and humility that really does need to go into being in address with this, staying in that sense in a human process of empathy, and grace in relation, while at the same time being willing to make strong distinctions, is none of that is attractive from the perspective of content delivery and ramming in that narrative. What do you mean? What are you saying? What's true here? What do you actually think? What are you even saying? Well, it's like, yeah, all of those things, that's actually what you should be asking yourself, okay, when you attempt to make sense of any of this. But that's not interesting to anywhere near the same degree. And so, anyway, so there are obviously lots of thoughts. I don't know how much, and so then I'm curious, we could sort of delve into any any particular claim, or it sounds like you set me on quite a course here in terms of I've kind of really engaged with Jiang's lectures, and not the ones on the great books, because again I find that to be less valuable for me personally. I'll just say that, not that those things aren't valuable to engage with, but. And I would say, I did reach out to his Substack, maybe whatever it was, 6 months ago. He had only just maybe appeared on one thing publicly then. Um, and he didn't respond. And he would never respond now. Because what he does want to go on is the most influential platforms. There's that clear drive there. I will say, though, you can find old videos of him speaking when he was running the either the international program or some alternative schooling program in China 10, 12 years ago, was having a dialogue about education, even brings a student onto the camera to speak, and they're speaking about empathy and what have you. So, you know, I really do see a really dedicated person really trying to create things which I also find myself to be in deep alignment with here. But it's curious. He is the in quotation marks Professor Jang. And there's something about the quotation marks of that professor title, which in a sense, like it demands, like it just does bring, not because I care that people have to be credentialized in order to have valuable things to say, but there's just something about that dynamic which speaks to the very uh, mystery of what he is as a character, which requires, it seems like, these questioning assessments of his person as well as his material and the whole context in which he's participating in. And so I guess that's why we have these culture lab contexts, but I'm unsure about sharing any of this, you know.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I know that I do think that this is a valuable thing to add to the mill, so to speak, of metabolization. But you know, I'll obviously be glad to share it with the network and what have you. So anyway.
Yeah, I was starting to, some things were starting to fold back in and kind of, I could see some of the bits starting to talk to each other more. I got that image when you were initially talking about I was sort of hearing it as like his epistemic style. It was the image of a bull in a china shop and just being like, oh, like there was the vectors, right? There was a directionality to it. And there was a kind of like making noise and things happening, but it really feels much more like a deconstructive effort. And then the reconstruction is almost offered as like a comedic relief.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
family's really important.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah, because guys, you should probably tidy this up, you know, after it's just like it's hilarious. He had said he did some stand-up comedy, you know. He actually said he did some stand-up comedy.
He's
He'd
the
kill
guy
it.
who pulls the handkerchief out of his pocket and it just keeps going.
Yeah, he's a remarkable character. I mean, anything that I do think in some extremely relevant way, I don't think there has been, I know at the level of the attentional prominence, it really has gone Jordan Peterson, Jang.
Yeah. And
Do you know what
and
I
that
mean?
makes sense. That's a logical progression in my opinion.
Yeah, it's wild. And of course, there have been so many like professors. Obviously, you've got Viveki, but obviously Viveki's rigor is it's just, you know, it's remote. You can't even, it's not appropriate to have them in the same category.
No.
Um, I, so, I'm, I'm curious if there's any more thoughts you want to tie together. I feel like I've sort of said everything that I have to say, at least in this particular transmission. So I wouldn't mind drawing it to a close after you share some thoughts if you have any to conclude.
Yeah, I'll finish that. Just give me a sec to plug back into it. Yeah, I think what you said about like not holding a criticism of one, well, like a criteria of one archetype to another one feels really important. And I think that deconstructive movement, he feels more like a jester figure, um, but with the appropriate like sort of sincerity in the domain of his expertise. And I don't he's definitely not religious. Like when he talks about the monad, that's not a religious person talking about the monad. It's not even a philosopher talking about the monad. And is it even a historian or is it just a storyteller? And that's kind of the and so but like the right storyteller with the right like instrumental backgrounds to to bypass various filters. Um, and I like what I'm getting out of this conversation is I think the right mode to engage him with is one of play. And that I think when sort of done well, that like rampage through a landscape, just like pointing out the patterns and all of these contrasts and transitions. And I think there's something animating. It's like he's clearing a space and mobilizing energy. And now someone can kind of come in and actually start like doing the meticulous building up of something. And maybe there's a real, that's the vigilante, and there's a real kind of like meeting him at the right level to celebrate what he's doing. Um, and in a way, like maybe if he is facing the world, he's leaving space behind him in some way where a home could be constructed. So, but then
Mm,
there was also the image of like the cowboy with his guns out, slinging them, and just slowly strings descending. And he's moving around so fast that he's starting to get tangled, and suddenly the motions are no longer coming from him
mm,
there. And so I think that's the always the risk with the attentional piece is like at what point I think one of the most powerful things a power broker can do is deliver the message without its sting. My analyst a long time ago told me he coined a complex. I don't know how true this is. He called it the mercurial complex, and it was basically like it's a form of bypass where you like fully understand the thing without ever touching it in contact. It's a common bypass for someone with a more like analytical, self-aware lens. And if I was like someone in power, I would want to like I would love Zhang for his ability to deliver the message in a way that can discharge the energy without actually having people do the metabolizing. And so I think
right,
he's really powerful in that sense for someone who has that kind of motivation.
right. Yeah. I have this paragraph here. Just like his thought, its affect is captivating, soothing, dangerous, salacious, revelatory, ordering, and challenging to old structures and patterns, while also being relatively simple in structure when taken in slices. It's chewed for you philosophy, explain like I'm 5 or 15 thinking, which I believe plays into the thumos pacifying patterns of content consumption loved by the late night algorithm, which
Beautiful.
is kind of just what you've said there, basically. And that is, Benjamin Studemaker will make this point, again and again in recognizing the ways that, what does he say, the 4 F's of faith, family, fandom, and future. He's kind of shoehorning future in there. By future, he means the way in which people project onto tech titans, the images they're painting of the future and how things will improve and whatever else. And rather than that energy of building and addressing the ills and challenges of the world with the revolutionary spirit as a libidinal creative force, with that thumos finding its purchase in the world, people are all into that fandom, whether it's sports and Marvel, and but in various ways, you could argue that there is a kind of presentation of narrative that Jiang is at risk of, if not, it might be. I wouldn't say it's the very condition of rising to prominence in attentionalism. I don't think that, but I do think that if you have that late night ritualistic energy of listening to on side, it helps with the reach. And so, but I have seen tremendous influence I mean, in some ways, for some considerable ill now that we reflect, I think plenty of good too at the more diffuse individual level. And that's a challenge because, again, if all you're doing is speaking to individuals, then you're speaking to some deeply impotent contexts, really. If the individuals aren't in relation, if they're not part of community building, culture making, and all these things, and it's just speaking to the atomized consumer in that sense. Not that there isn't, some spark or dignity in all of that, but I think that's one of the things that has been missed and is missed in the culture war writ large, by both sides in different ways, but certainly on the more libertarian, sort of conservative Peterson arc of things, the sanctity of the individual, but ultimately the parasitization of the individual through Daily Wire adverts, these types of things. Um, so yeah, there is but the positivity I meant to include there was that again, I do see there is sort of a generativity of ground or maybe seed that is scattered in the coming together of the difference of those of the dialectic, at least at that playing out. And I do think we see people move on from their idols, you know, and it happens all of a sudden with a bit of a whimper in a way, because people will defend them to the last, and then all of a sudden their attention is taken up by something else. And there's something positive about that, while at the same time, in the same breath, there's a deep negativity there because just look at how many people are remorseful about their support of Trump. You know, much of that world became serious supporters of Trump. And now they're like, well, we don't like anything that's happening here at the level of the geopolitical changes and these wars and what have you. And then, you know, there's obviously a big conversation to have there because Trump is a many-faced character in terms of what he represents. And, he's on the one hand, he's a strange mixture of, again, a bull in a china shop, while at the same time also being as manipulable as a bull with just the wave of a red flag, right? Or a white flag. And so that is just something very interesting because, again, and, Yang will point to this in fairness. It's like, well, what of the empire? What of the system? What of that level of analysis, which, irrespective of Orange Man bad, is going to have some influence on Trump? While at the same time, the badness of Orange Man, it's remarkable to defend that particular naked emperor. It's so there we are. The point is that there is something very concerning that if the only, in quotation marks, progression of sense making or narrative making about what's happening in the world and our lives just moves on from one next, in a sense, dialectical figure to another without that actually grounding or embodying in a deeper relationship with reality, then we may just be led along to the next poor placement of trust in some figure. And that would be, in a sense, precisely what power would argue for, and, as you say, why they might be quite happy about what Jang is doing. And that is, I guess, that's ultimately where the critique in terms of what it is at the level of mode of address and participation and engaging in the second person field, that's where it starts to ground into maybe an explanation of why we might be interested in this line of understanding. But it's a strange thing because on the one hand, it's subtle when experienced at the level of why should anybody care about this who just wants to tune into, the content wars to deliver the next truth. And yet at the same time, it's the most present, palpable encounter one can have. So it's not subtle at all. It's a strange thing. And anyway, maybe I'll bring it to a close there.